Good luck, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, we're live now, Medina. Whenever you want to go ahead.
Okay, great. So welcome everyone to our COVID-19 vaccines panel. And I just want to thank everyone who's here for attending, everyone who's watching today, and thank our panelists for being here, who I'll introduce shortly. My name is Medina Wan, and I'm a vaccine development scientist based in the UK. And I'll be moderating the panel today and sharing your questions with the panelists. So just before I introduce the speakers, I just want to give you a short introduction about Black in Immuno. So we were founded last summer in 2020 as a community organization who is dedicated to creating connections and supporting the community of scientists and others working in it and who are interested in immunology, which is the study of the immune system. And together we've been working to celebrate and uplift and amplify Black voices in the field of immunology, and to make sure that the work of Black scientists goes beyond just the field of science and to wider audiences, because we know how important science and immunology is to wider society. So before we start, I just want to acknowledge our major sponsors. We've had a lot of sponsors who have contributed financially to allow us to do a lot of this work. So one of our major sponsors is the Immune Deficiency Foundation, and they're a patient advocacy nonprofit organization that helps countless patients with their journey with immune deficiencies. And our second major sponsor is Imperial College London. They are a leading research institution in the UK who lead through innovation and passion. And both of our major sponsors, as well as our other contributors, can be found on our website, which is blackinimmuno.org. So today for the panel, we're going to focus on the COVID vaccines. We're going to talk a bit about the kind of general basis behind vaccines, how they were developed, why they work, and why they're so important to tackling the pandemic. So that's going to be the first section of the panel. And the second section will focus more on the impact that the pandemic has had on Black communities around the world, and the issues that Black communities have faced in accessing, kind of having equal access to healthcare, and what's being done to tackle this inequality. So after each section, you'll have a chance to ask questions. So you can just add your questions into the YouTube chat, and we'll make sure that we'll pass on as many as we can to the panelists. We really want this to be a conversation between not just the panelists who are here, but also between everyone who's watching today, because it's important that everyone is able to share and provide input. So yeah, we really encourage you to share those questions. Just some basic housekeeping before I introduce our panelists. If you post on social media about the panel, which we really encourage you to do, please use the hashtag #BlackInImmunoCOVIDpanel. And if you can capitalize the first letter of each word, that will really help with accessibility. Like I mentioned, you can submit your questions on the YouTube live feed, and I'll pass those along. And a recording of this session will also be available. So if you know anyone who wasn't able to join today, feel free to direct them to our YouTube channel. So now it's my absolute pleasure to be able to introduce our panelists. Together, they have a huge amount of expertise in infectious disease, vaccines, kind of global health, and they've spoken about issues facing the Black communities in healthcare, and kind of all have advocated for better inclusion of Black people in the healthcare system and also in science. So the first person I'd like to introduce is Dr. Mustafa Bitey. He has over a decade of research experience and started his kind of research career at the Medical Research Council in the Gambia, where he was involved in research against several infectious diseases, such as malaria. He obtained his PhD in microbial proteomics from the University of Aberdeen in Scotland, and he's currently working as a postdoctoral scientist at the University of Oxford, based in the UK. He is a member of the core scientific team that's been involved in the development of the Oxford AstraZeneca COVID vaccine, but he's also been involved in the development of other vaccines against other viruses, such as MERS, Lassa, and Nipah viruses. So welcome, Dr. Mustafa Bitey, and great to have you with us. And next up, we have Dr. Mikada Robinson, who earned her MD and PhD from Stanford University. And she is also working as a postdoctoral infectious disease specialist, also at the University of Stanford, which is based in the US. She's received several fellowships to pursue her research and is currently focusing on understanding how newly emerging viruses interact with their infected hosts. And in response to the COVID pandemic, she's also been studying the effects of age on the immune response to COVID. And she's also been a really good communicator about the pandemic, spreading evidence-based information through her column Ask an Expert, which is on Very Well Health. And she's commented in major media outlets about the pandemic. So welcome, Dr. Robinson. And last but not least, we have Dr. Alcendor with us today, who is an associate professor at the Center for AIDS Health Disparities Research in Meharry Medical College in the US. And Dr. Alcendor completed his postgraduate studies at the NIH and at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. And he studied many aspects of disease, including viral infection, but also things like cancer. And he recently led the development into the investigation of drug therapies for COVID patients, and sits on a number of different scientific panels and boards, including the American Lung Association COVID-19 Action Initiative, and oversees the antiviral and immunomodulating therapies, pandemic-related social behavior and racial disparities scientific advisor boards. He's been another big advocate for addressing vaccine hesitancy in minority groups and bringing attention to how the pandemic has disproportionately affected minority populations as well. So welcome everyone to the panel. And I'd like to get started with just kind of a general question about vaccines first, just to talk about what are vaccines and what is their purpose? Why do we think they're so important? For this, I'd like to go to Dr. Bitey.
Thank you, Medina, and thanks to all the audience and my fellow panelists for participating in this important gathering. So I welcome you all. To answer your question about vaccines, so what are vaccines? Vaccines are a type of a medicine. We refer to vaccine as medicinal products. And what they do is that they train our body's defense system, which is known as our immune system. And they help us to be able to fight a disease that we are yet to come into contact with. So vaccination, which is the process of getting people vaccinated, is believed to be the most effective public health intervention after clean drinking water. And they have been in use to fight diseases beginning way back in the early 100 CE. So that was way prior to Edward Jenner's successful innovation of the cowpox inoculation in 1796. So we have many vaccines being developed in the early 1930s. And in the middle part of the 20th century, we have seen active part of vaccine research and development taking place. So in a nutshell, a vaccine is a medicinal product that helps our body to fight an infection before we come into contact with that infection.
Great, thank you very much. That's a nice kind of basis for which to set the rest of our questions on. So maybe what I wanted to kind of lead on to next is, with the current COVID vaccines, obviously we now have lots of different types of vaccines that have been developed. And I think sometimes it can be confusing when you have so many different technologies and so many different types that are out there, and people don't necessarily have a huge amount of choice. It depends on what countries have supplied. So I wondered if, as a panel, you could discuss the different types of vaccines that have been developed. What are the kind of key differences, and why do we have so many different vaccines available? Maybe Dr. Alcendor, I'll go to you first. Oh, you're just muted.
Going from the inside out, we would start with nucleic acid types of vaccines in the form of DNA vaccines that encode proteins of an infectious agent that could be translated in a cell for that cell to start to present that antigen in the context of the immune system and make immune effector cells and antibodies to it. So that can be in the form of RNA vaccines like we see with Pfizer and Moderna, or DNA vaccines that are encoded on a plasmid that can be injected into a person's body and a protein translated. And so going outward, we have subunit vaccines. So this is where you have a vaccine where you have a small part of an important protein antigen from an infectious agent that can be used to prime the immune system to produce an immune response to. And then, of course, we can have whole virus vaccines. In this case, the virus has to be treated in some ways to render it weaker, or for that matter, to kill it in terms of inhibiting its ability to replicate. And of course, whole virus vaccines carry with them the possibility of being able to not kill all of the virus in that inoculum and maybe producing an infection. And so you also have, these are called vector vaccines. And so these vector vaccines would possibly encode an important viral protein in a vector virus, like the adenovirus that you see in the AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson vaccines. These are vector-related vaccines where there's an adenovirus that basically has been stripped away of all of the genes that are required for replication. And instead of that, the spike protein from the coronavirus is inserted in place. So the packaging proteins are intact, the packaging sequences are intact on both the 5' and 3' end. And of course, you have the insertion of the spike glycoprotein in the middle of those two things. And so because it's a defective replicating adenovirus, it cannot cause you harm. It is only there to deliver a very important protein to prime the immune system.
Great, thanks so much. So it sounds like, even though you have these different technologies, the kind of common part is all of them in some ways are trying to mimic some part of the infectious agent, right? So,
Exactly.
you have these different technologies, but they're all essentially trying to do the same thing.
Exactly.
Okay, great. So I guess I'd like to ask Dr. Robinson if you have anything that you'd like to add in your experience in terms of the different COVID vaccines.
No, I mean, I think Dr. Alcendor gave a great review. I think that based off of the type of vaccine, whether it's just a piece of the virus, so as he said, the spike protein, so that's the protein that's found to be very immunogenic, so it makes a very good sort of immune response compared to other pieces, versus a weakened or attenuated sort of vaccine. I think that a lot of the vaccines from this pandemic have been sort of subunit vaccines or DNA, RNA vaccines. And I think that's actually been a very interesting sort of breakthrough, right? So the majority of the vaccines that we've used previously have been sort of weakened or attenuated whole virus vaccines. And I think we're now in this really incredible space where this pandemic has led to a lot of minds being put on the same question. And so we do have sort of this is sort of the first sort of mRNA vaccine to be used so in such a widespread manner. And I think part of why some of these DNA or RNA vaccines have sort of moved to the forefront, well, it's really twofold, but I think in part it's because the sort of ability to make a lot of it and to make it quickly is a bit more efficient than some of the whole virus vaccines, which require you to make a lot of the virus. You need to passage it many times and can often require multiple other things. So if you think about sort of the flu vaccine, right, you need it's a lot of the development is in chicken eggs, and so you need enough of those eggs to actually make enough of the virus. So I think we're actually in a really interesting time right now where we're moving into the next generation of vaccine development.
That's a really great point, Dr. Robinson. And I think it highlights, I guess, how unusual the situation is, right? We have disease all the time, but we don't have global pandemics, like this every year. Whereas obviously vaccines for diseases like the flu are yearly. And I guess because of the unusual nature of this pandemic, we've really had to adapt. And that's why you're seeing things like maybe slightly different technologies that people aren't as familiar with But like you said, it allows us to do things like produce large quantities in a short amount of time. And that kind of leads me to my next question. So one of the kind of great things is that we have been able to produce vaccines very quickly, which again is very unusual. Normally it takes years and years to develop an effective vaccine. So maybe Dr. Biteye, I'd like to go to you, since you were involved in the development of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. Maybe you can discuss why this development was so quick, and how we made sure that the development still allowed for safe vaccines to be produced.
Yeah, that's a very important question, and a question I like to talk about a lot, because most of the time people think that these vaccines have been developed within a year. Yeah, that is true. The pandemic started last year, and in 2020, end of 2019, going to 2020. And before we know it, we already started vaccine development like a few months into the pandemic being declared a pandemic. I just want people to know that, yes, we have the opportunity to develop the vaccines within a year, but the work that has been going on behind the scenes to get us to where we are is something that's been going on for many, many, many years. So this is built on, the failures and successes of many, many years of development. So in our case, for example, in Oxford, we were fortunate enough to be involved in the development of a vaccine against another coronavirus called Middle East Respiratory Syndrome coronavirus. And 1 year on into the development of that vaccine, then the pandemic hits. So what that allows us to do is to be able to transfer that technology, transfer that existing knowledge we already had about how we develop that vaccine into the development of the COVID-19 vaccine. So before we even started developing our COVID-19 vaccine, we already had first-hand information about what sort of dose should we use if we are to develop a vaccine against COVID. How do we formulate a vaccine based on the spike protein of the based on the spike protein of the virus? But we also know what to target in the virus, in the sense that it wasn't a completely new virus to us, because we already knew viruses in the same family as SARS-CoV-2. So that gave us somewhere to start. The other thing also that was unusual, that doesn't normally happen in the development of a vaccine, is the willingness of people to participate in vaccine trials. Usually when you try to develop a vaccine, it takes many, many, many months before you recruit the right number of people into trials. And these are normally like small scale phase 1 trials. So, and also after that, what normally happens is when you collect the data and put the data together, you have to present it to regulators before you can, apply for more funding from funders to go on to do bigger phase 2 and phase 3 trials. These take time. With COVID, we realized, this did not happen, because people were willing to come forward and participate in the trials in large numbers, which was really good. The other thing also was funding wasn't a problem, in the sense that, we've seen the socioeconomic impact that COVID had in the lives of everybody. So there was money available to scientists to speed up the development of vaccines, but also to participate in research regarding COVID, in addition to coming up with drugs and better treatments, but also understanding the disease dynamics. That funding also was really available. The other thing also that normally slows down vaccine development is usually the way the vaccine process, the clinical trial process takes place. So you will normally do a phase 1, then phase 2, then a phase 3, and these things do happen in sequence. With the pandemic, with this development of the COVID vaccines, we've managed to do all these different stages in parallel. So the data was readily available to the regulators, so we didn't have to complete one phase of the trials before we get the data forward to the regulators for them to review and then allow us to proceed. So the data was readily given to the regulators as they become available. So they were reviewing things as the trials were going on. And what this does, it allows us, to be able to do the different phases of the trials that are involved in the development of a vaccine, which is phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, at the same in parallel rather than in sequence. So that also helps to speed up the process. But I also said, I will also say, I think as a human race, I think we are quite fortunate in the sense that we are dealing with a virus that is completely novel, but it's not something we completely lack knowledge about in terms of related viruses within the same family. So it would have been a completely different picture if we started developing a vaccine against COVID, if we didn't know anything about other viruses in the same family with COVID, because what that would mean is, before we even get to the position where we could start formulating vaccines against the virus, we would first of all have to understand the biology of the disease first. And in the case of COVID, we were able to bypass that process much quicker because we already have existing knowledge about other viruses within the same family.
Yeah, that's
also
a really great point. Sorry, go on, Dr.
Oh, I was
Robinson.
just going to say, also just to piggyback off of that, I think also part of it also was that I think a lot of these companies made an upfront sort of manufacturing investment before all of the clinical trials were done. So I do think that some of the reasons why it takes so long for vaccines to get to market is because of sort of costs and decisions that have to be made. And so I think early on, there was a decision to invest heavily in the manufacturing so they could make enough of it. And if that vaccine had not worked, it would have been a sunk cost. But I think the combination of deciding that this was a very urgent need and that they were going to invest very early in being able to make as much of it as possible was important in getting it out in a large scale early on in the later days of 2020.
Yeah, so I wanted to just add a little bit to that. One of the things that in the United States, we had a program called Project Warp Speed. And this was a $10 billion investment by the federal government, the Trump administration. And it was to fund a number of companies, some of them that have never produced an FDA-approved drug, an opportunity with $10 billion, meaning that when money is no object, vaccine companies can do things very differently. And what I mean by that, I'm saying is that no vaccine company would start manufacturing at the same time phase 1 studies start. But when you have no money as no object, and you have a pandemic that is killing people at a level of, at that time, maybe 4,000 people a day, you have to do something very different. And so when you start manufacturing, when you start phase 1 trials, and then you overlap the different phases, and you understand clearly that the Data Safety Monitoring Board will not slow this down. And again, one of the things about this process that happened quickly is that this was information for many people to be hesitant because they thought this vaccine was rushed. And they thinking that it was rushed, they made shortcuts that gave people a vaccine that was not very good. And so this is still the basis of some hesitancy in communities of color that we find. And so when you have, and again, I have to say that Pfizer and Moderna delivered on the mission for Project Warp Speed, and that is 300 million doses of a safe and effective vaccine by January 1st, 2021. And so Pfizer delivered that on the 11th of December of 2020. And of course, Moderna came back on December 18th and delivered that as well. Not the 3 million doses, but a safe and effective vaccine. And I want to say something about the RNA vaccines carry with them the ability to be modular. So a modular vaccine is a vaccine that you can change very quickly to accommodate changes in the virus. You see what I'm saying? And so this is very important. And of course, these vaccines can be made very quickly, and you have the option of having combinatorial vaccines. A combinatorial vaccine is when you can put the flu and COVID-19 together in one RNA cassette and deliver that combination to an individual. And again, the flu vaccine traditionally has been very poor in terms of uptake and efficacy. It believes that implementing this as an RNA vaccine will increase the efficacy and possible uptake of influenza vaccines.
Yeah, I mean, that's very important. I agree to all of those points you've raised. There was a lot of risk taken in terms of the financial aspect of things to make sure the manufacturing processes of these vaccines are done before even proving that these vaccines will work.
Right.
So that was a huge investment and a huge gamble that pharmaceutical companies have to take. But I also have to stress also the importance of having existing public health infrastructures that allows the rapid expansion of the different clinical trials across different regions of the country. So we also have infrastructure in our hospitals, and we also have people who are well trained, within those settings to be able to conduct clinical trials. And it was very important that this existing infrastructure was there to allow all this testing and these trials and monitoring to be done in a safe and effective manner. So yeah, all of these factors put together, it makes it possible to develop the vaccine within this period we've seen.
Yeah, it sounds like there's so many different factors, but when there are resources and when there is a will and a need, that's really when things come together. So now, if anyone has questions from the audience, please do send them in, and I'll share them with the panelists. Just to kind of start things off as we're waiting for questions, I wondered if we could talk more about the new variants that we're seeing arise from kind of the original COVID virus, and what kind of impact that has on the vaccines that people have been receiving and continue to receive today.
So I want to start because my area is molecular virology, and I just want to explain to people what a variant is. And so the idea is that viruses produce variants as a natural process of their replication, meaning this is the evolution of a virus goes through its natural process of replicating in a human cell. There are many changes that occur because the virus uses a protein to replicate itself. In this case, the coronavirus, an RNA-dependent RNA polymerase. This is a polymerase that when it makes a mistake, does not have the ability to go back and change that mistake. And so what you have is accumulation of mistakes that are made. Some of these mistakes will give the virus an advantage. These mistakes can happen anywhere in the viral genome. In the case of the mistakes that you've seen made in the variants, in terms of the coronavirus variants, the multitude of them are made within the spike protein domains, both S1 and S2. And the idea is that these mistakes that are made are selected for in the cell, meaning that if you make a mistake as a virus replicating, that particular virus, if it's not a mistake that the virus can live with, that virus will not survive. So it is a selection process for viruses that are very good at survival and perpetuating an infection, you see? And the idea is that if you're able to perpetuate an infection by way of a mutation can allow a virus to grow faster. And if a virus grows faster, it's likely to produce pathology quicker and even more so. So a person has less time to wait before they seek medical attention. And the idea is that if you can grow quicker, you're likely to be able to put a person in a hospital sooner as well. So the possibilities of high transmissibility, along with more severe disease that many of these variants cause, the greatest concern for us now, will the vaccines that we have now protect us in terms of our immune preparedness for these variants to come? What we clearly know is that the immune response that we have is less effective against these variants than the original Wuhan strain that all of the vaccines were designed with. However, it is very clear that if we have the Pfizer vaccine, and this data is out there, that against the D variant, that variant, the latest one and of course there's the Lambda variant also now, but let's talk about the D variant that is approaching 51% in the United States in terms of the overall transmissions that we see. It turns out that if you have one dose of the Pfizer vaccine, you're down to about 33% protection. But if you have 2 doses, you're at about 88% protection. And I think it's important that we tell people that are out there, getting their complete dosage regimen for these mRNA vaccines are essential.
That's a great point, Dr. Alcendor. It makes me think a little bit of antibiotics and how you want people to take the full course. Slightly different issue, but yes. it's about kind of trusting the data that we have, and the data currently says that it's 2 doses, for a lot of the vaccines that offers you protection. So
this is important. This is important because 1 in 10 individuals in the US do not come back for their second dose, and that's a concern.
Yeah, and just again to piggyback off of that, I was going to say that I think this is also why it's so important for us to try to reach the highest level, or as close to a herd immunity or at herd immunity as possible, is because having that herd immunity can really prevent these new variants from creating new outbreaks. And so we're kind of in a situation where each of these, this COVID-19 is sort of this Goldilocks virus, right? That like, it's not so virulent that it sort of burned out very early, So even in the early stages of this pandemic in 2019, it was thought to be the weaker version of SARS-1. But we really saw that it has these components and these characteristics that led it to actually cause this global pandemic that the first SARS virus wasn't able to do. But now that we're sort of in this stage where it's sort of taken hold in in every continent, we now need to think a little bit more about sort of what's going to happen as it continues to mutate, as it gets to know us better and learns how our immune system works and how it can evade our immune system. And so I do think, again, like getting to a place where we have a blanket amount of immunity, a herd immunity level, is incredibly important to prevent these outbreaks from happening. Because if we have enough people vaccinated, we don't have to worry about the Delta or the Delta Plus or whatever comes after that. Because we are getting some good immunity still with our vaccinations, and if there's enough people, we can really extinguish the virus instead of leading to sort of a more endemic virus that we're going to have to deal with for an indefinite period of time.
Yeah, that's a great point, Dr. Robinson. And it leads on to one of the questions that we have from the audience. So we have on YouTube, someone, MA, is asking about thoughts on intellectual property and manufacturing, and really what that means for global kind of equitable healthcare globally, and kind of speaking to your point about, you know, the virus being in all continents now, and how to protect people. We need to be able to establish immunity in you know, wherever this virus is propagating.
Yeah, I want to start. I've been writing on this in a journal, Vaccine, recently. And what I wrote about is global inequity when it comes to vaccines. So when we look at global equity for vaccines, this has been a poor turnout. And the reason being is that it turns out that 16% of rich countries have 60% of vaccine supply currently. We have countries like Canada that has 38 million citizens, but somehow they have 300 million doses of vaccine. And so what I'm saying is that rich countries are able to go out and purchase vaccine contracts very early before the vaccine is even manufactured. However, poor resource countries do not have this ability. So when you think about Nigeria, that has 220 million citizens, they have very little access to vaccines. And what I mean by that, we are not a US or a UK community. We are a global community. We have to approach global equity with vaccines in the way that we did for polio and smallpox. We have to make this a collaborative effort that runs global. And the idea is that we have to make vaccines accessible for everybody. In South America, they have no access to vaccines. They're vaccinating people that are 70 years and older because they just don't have access. This has to change. And of course, the World Health Organization, with their efforts with COVAX, is a very important start. But we need heavier players in this, people that have simply money to buy vaccines.
Yeah, that's a great point. We definitely are a global community, and so much of this pandemic, we keep hearing, you know, the virus doesn't respect borders, and we've very much seen that play out.
That's right.
Dr. Batey, I don't know if you wanted to answer this. I know you previously worked in the Gambia in research. I don't know if you wanted to comment on that aspect of the COVID vaccines.
Yeah, so can I just draw you back to the issue of the variants of concerns that are circulating before I answer the question. I just want to emphasize the importance of statistics when it comes to looking at the different vaccine. I understand my colleagues are based in the US, where the Pfizer vaccine is the most widely used. For the benefit of the UK audience, here in the UK, the most commonly used vaccines are the Oxford AstraZeneca and the Pfizer vaccines. And the data coming from Public Health England with regards to vaccine efficacy against the Delta variant is that if you take a single dose of either the Oxford or the Pfizer vaccine, you get 75% protection. If you get double dose of either of these vaccines, your protection against the Delta variant, which is currently circulating in the UK and in most part of the world, is 90%. So with regards to vaccine inequality, I think is a big concern. A lot of people are coming out, voicing out their concern about why we are seeing this disparity between the global south and also the global north, where vaccines are available now to pretty much every person in their general population. We have seen in the UK and in most part of the world, in the developed countries, where where vaccines have been approved for use in children who are a low risk group in terms of COVID. And we haven't seen a single dose of vaccination being given to people in certain part of the world, with high risk of COVID. I think that's a big problem. So approving vaccine for use in 12 to 15-year-olds in developed countries, when we still haven't got a single dose of vaccine administered, in certain countries in the global south, just tells you the level of inequality that is happening. And as my colleague already alluded to, the pandemic is a global pandemic. We are not safe until everybody is safe. So having the virus contained in one part of the world is not going to be enough to bring the pandemic into under control. We need to control the spread of the virus in every part of the world, to cut down on variants that are cropping everywhere, left, right, center in different part of the world, but also to try and cut the chain of transmission and then bring the pandemic under control. And until we do that as a global society, we won't be achieving any gains from the massive vaccination that is happening. Because even if we are successful in controlling the virus against a particular variant due to vaccination, another variant may crop from other part of the world that will just sweep across the rest of the world. So we are not safe until everybody is safe.
Absolutely.
Basically.
And I just want to, so that kind of leads nicely onto our second section. I'm just conscious of time, so I'd like us to just kind of start to focus now a bit more about the impact that COVID has had specifically on Black communities. As we've already mentioned, Black communities obviously are found throughout the world. So, again, we're addressing this from a global perspective. And just kind of to frame this conversation, both for the benefit of us and for the audience who are listening in, I just want to kind of highlight that the way that we use the category Black when we refer to Black communities, it's really about the way that people self-identify, but also the way that people are racialized by others. You're kind of identified as Black by other people who interact with you. So it really represents a very diverse group of people around the world. And so when we talk about Black people as a peoples, we're not talking about a particular shared biology. We're really talking about the kind of social factors that impact people who identify and are racialized in a particular way. So kind of leading on that, I'd like for us just to set the scene is to talk about the kind of history that of medicine and science and how Black communities have kind of been treated by these different establishments. And maybe Dr. Robinson, with your kind of background in medicine, I don't know if you'd like to discuss a bit about this.
Sure, I'm happy to start out on this question. I think that a lot of sort of the historical inequities have really been brought into the spotlight with a pandemic like COVID-19. I think just initially thinking from like a medical standpoint, we've seen that this virus disproportionately affects people with underlying health conditions. So things like diabetes, high blood pressure, obesity, kidney disease, all things that are disproportionately increased in Black communities have been found to lead to worse outcomes of COVID-19. And data from the CDC has shown that Black Americans have a 3 times as increased rate of hospitalizations, are twice as likely to die of COVID-19. So we know that we're having a disproportionate effect of COVID-19 in our communities. I think that coupled with some of the historical incidents that have happened, particularly in America, but also in other places, things like the Tuskegee syphilis study, et cetera, where there has led to an overall distrust of Black communities with the healthcare system and some feeling like, that, potentially there could be some experimentation on them, or they're going to try something out there and then see what happens, which is kind of what's happened in some senses in different times. I think that coupling has really just exponentially led to as many people have said, just like two different sort of pandemics, right? That certain people are kind of getting vaccinated and working from home, and other people are having to sort of be exposed, as well as are less likely to get vaccinated and then are at higher risk for sort of more severe outcomes. So I think this has really been a time where I think we can just drastically see the differences. And I'm hopeful that we can start to sort of tailor some of our approaches to these issues. And I think that in part means that while there should be a broader response to COVID-19, I think also tailoring our approach to communities that maybe have less access to care, access to vaccines is really important if we want to keep increasing the percentage of vaccinated people and decreasing the number of COVID-19 sort of morbidity and mortality rates. And I would just also mention that for people who are feeling like the choice is being vaccinated or having nothing happen, to really reframe that, because the difference is really being vaccinated, and then you are at risk for even mild COVID-19 infections can really have some long lasting sequelae. And we don't know which of those people are going to go down that path. The idea of long COVID or PASC syndrome, we're still learning a lot about. And so I think we really need to remember that this virus really can have repercussions that span a gradation. It's not just, whether or not you're going to die of this virus, but sort of what is your long-term life quality of life going to be.
That's a great point. Yeah, I think sometimes we don't, assessing risk can be quite hard. And I think it's always important to put that context back. It's like you said, it's not just about getting the vaccine and doing nothing. The point of the vaccine is to protect. So without it, you are risking a higher chance of getting the virus. Dr. Alcendor, I know that you have spoken and written about some of the issues facing the Black communities, historical, as Dr. Robinson has mentioned, but obviously still current issues in the healthcare system that are impacting Black communities. So if you could speak a bit more about that, that would be great. Oh, you're just on mute. Okay.
So I represented boots on the ground, where I got out and talked to communities. We call them communities of color, underserved communities, or marginalized communities when it comes to health and wellness. And so when we think about your predisposition to contract COVID-19, you have to discuss social determinants of health, meaning that your economic situation, your ability to access healthcare, your ability to drink clean water, your ability to be able to be in a stable environment that is not harmful to your health. You see what I'm saying? So social determinants of health, if they're poor, they can directly predispose you to COVID-19 transmission. And so when it comes to the inequities that we see in the healthcare system, they are there for everyone to see every day. I hear people telling me that accessing the healthcare system for them has been a nightmare, meaning that they are treated insensitively. They are not offered the most best options for care. They are disrespected. And again, they believe that they're getting substandard care, meaning that if you don't have insurance, it is considered that if you don't have insurance, you would be seen by a different group of doctors. But if you have medical insurance, then you would be seen by another group of doctors. And so what it tells you is that there is a great divide when it comes to service by the medical community in general. And so people are aware of that. Now, when it comes to research, big institutions, that is of higher learning, go into communities, underserved communities. They establish themselves as researchers that go out and get data. Once that data is gotten and published and submitted for an extramural grant, the dissemination of that data to communities of color have been very poor or non-existent. And so what I'm saying is that I talked to a retired military personnel, and his greatest concern after being in the military, because in the military, he got vaccines routinely. What he was concerned mostly about the COVID vaccine is that people would persist with this inequity and provide people of color with a less effective vaccine and give other people a better vaccine. And this is a retired military person. And his concern is that there would be a basis for inequity at the level of vaccine distribution. And I thought that was hard for me to hear because I didn't think of that. But here's a retired military person that get vaccines all the time and was concerned about inequities at the level of vaccine distribution for Blacks or people of color and non-Hispanic whites.
Yeah, it's kind of, you see how widespread some of those fears and distrust are. And, with all the things that we've discussed, it's completely understandable that, I've seen stories throughout the pandemic of, how different Black people and people of color have been treated. And it makes you quite, it's really frustrating to see. So, it's a completely reasonable kind of mistrust and skepticism to have. So I guess I'd like for us to talk a bit more about what can we do, because obviously acknowledging all the issues is important, but then we need to know how to move forward from that because we don't want to be stuck in that same position. Dr. Bate, maybe you could speak about, with your experience in research, if you've observed any kind of changes in practices, or if there's anything you think we could do to improve from the research side of things going forward in the future.
Yeah, there's a lot we need to do to improve things, but I also will have to acknowledge the existing measures we have in place to improve things and also to right the wrong. So first of all, I think people will be aware that obviously at the beginning of the pandemic, there were like 3 French doctors who suggested that, the vaccine should be tested in Africa. And, there was an understandable anger across the global, community about that statement. And they later apologized. So there's also a myth circulating that, these vaccines have been trialed in New Guinea or in Senegal, and they've killed so many children and all that stuff. But these are not true. I just want to make people aware that, the worldwide outrage about, the malpractices, that happens, within the medical community within the scientific community by big pharmaceutical companies, has made it possible, for the pharmaceutical companies, it has forced them to have a better, behavior when it comes to the development of this COVID vaccine. So more importantly, also the whole world, has watched, the current vaccines being developed. I've never seen, the media have so much interest in the work we're doing, than anything else during this pandemic. My bosses have done so many, media, outreach than any other, time in their career during this pandemic. I personally have done this far more time than I've ever done in my career. So yeah, and the reason for that is because of the watchful eye that people have on what's been going on during the pandemic, but also historically what has happened in the past. So yes, there are also other measures that have been put in place to make sure historically what has happened in the past is not repeated or is unlikely to be repeated. This idea of informed consent in medical research, where people are given the opportunity, to make an informed choice about whether they want to participate or not, and also to withdraw their participation anytime they like without having to give a reason for that. So that's one way of, bringing in transparency in research. We also have ethical committees that sits to look at research questions, or maybe look at a particular research and what benefit it will have to the community and the people it serves. And the whole reason of doing this is to bring more transparency into research. And the people who decide on whether this research should go ahead are just people, ordinary people in the community, who will just judge the research on the merit of what it brings to the community, rather than on the content rather than based on its scientific content. So all these things have happened and have continued to evolve, to just bring more transparency in research, but also to wrong the rights that have happened previously. So for me, I think the idea of informed consent definitely places the power on the individuals to say, I want to participate in this research and I want to withdraw my consent from or participation from this research whenever I like. And that is a great thing we have now as a global community when it comes to transparency in research.
That's great to hear. So we have a question from the audience. Dr. Robinson, I don't know if you had anything to add to that conversation, but otherwise I'll jump in from that question.
I have something to add.
Go ahead.
I have a little to add, and that is when you think about things that you could do better, we need more minority participation in clinical trials. We need to do away with the misinformation that is out there that comes with participating in a clinical trial. We need people to establish ways of educating. Health literacy has to be a part of our efforts going forward. We just have too many people that don't understand enough about their health and wellness to make informed choices when they go to the physician. And so these are some of the things that we can do. And of course, we have to have social and economic equity. No matter how it comes, we need that. We need to be on an even playing field when it comes to increasing the quality of our social determinants of health going forward.
Yeah, completely.
And, yeah, I would also say that just just in line with that, that having other people, not just people who are participating, but physicians who are running trials, like Dr. Pitaya, like having our faces, I think helps people. Having your doctor who may look like you, or people who are running trials, people who are scientists, I think that can also help because it allows people to feel like some camaraderie with the person who's asking them to do this. And I think that may also be an important point, is to have people in all levels, more diversity at all the different levels of running these trials and in the healthcare system in general.
Yeah, that's a great comment. Thank you very much, Dr. Robinson. So I'm just gonna go over some of the audience questions that we have. So one question that we have, and I've heard this a lot during the pandemic, and this has been addressed very differently by different scientists and physicians, but so Faye Bruce is asking, from your perspective, is there anything genetic that predisposes Black people to poor outcomes when we get COVID-19? And anyone feel free to jump in. I know, we've mentioned things like social determinants. But it's quite a hotly debated question.
So if we go back to the start of the pandemic, there was some misinformation circling in the Black community that melanin in your skin had an advantage of protecting you against COVID-19. And it turns out that was completely false. Even more so, it was believed that at that time, most of the people that had transmissions were non-Hispanic whites. And it was believed that somehow Blacks didn't get this infection. This was the same kind of talk we had in the US when HIV started, meaning that Blacks were not getting HIV. And we know clearly that any disease presented in a community that has poor social determinants of health, that disease will spread tremendously. We know that. And so there was another issue of how the blood type would allow you to defend yourself against COVID-19 somehow. The idea is that you had a certain blood type, you were less likely to get COVID-19. And so it turns out that the ACE2 receptor that is responsible for binding the spike protein from the coronavirus is not expressed on blood cells. And when I say blood cells, I'm talking about red blood cells. You see what I'm saying? And so people came up with this idea, but there was clearly no scientific rationale to support it. And so there are a number of these things that people are saying, but the scientific rationale, and the data is simply not there.
So I mean, I would definitely.
Go. Yeah, I was going to add to what Alcendor has said. There is no scientific evidence to prove that having a certain genetic condition or type predispose you to death from COVID. The simple fact is the fact that if you look at the way the pandemic has, the distribution, the dynamics of the pandemic across the globe, we have seen more death from the pandemic in the global north than we have seen in the global south, where the people are even poorer. If you look at in Africa, in general, for example, which has a very young population and all that stuff, there are less COVID deaths in Africa. And when the pandemic started, the modeling that was done was that, this pandemic, if this modeling was right, was going to kill far more people in Africa than anywhere else across the globe. And we haven't seen that. In fact, they fare better in this pandemic than any other continent, although this is not popularized as much as other gains are popularized across the other part of the world. But yet, in a nutshell, there's no genetic condition or genetic, underlying genetic, or you don't have to get a certain genetic type, to be vulnerable or to have a higher risk of dying from COVID. It's mostly socioeconomic, and the socioeconomic factors, as my colleagues have already alluded to, are related to poor, the type of job you do, the condition of your housing. If you consider people of ethnic minorities living in the West, we are more likely to live in multi-generational households than our white counterpart. And that gives you, that predisposes or increases your risk of dying from COVID, but also from catching the virus. Other factors with regards to the type of job you do, our jobs, people from the ethnic minorities are more public facing than, they don't allow us to, most of the jobs people in ethnic minorities do don't allow them to work from home. They are more of public facing job. And the more, you are out there, working in public, the more likely your risk is gonna be, of catching COVID. So that increases your risk and also predisposes you to the virus. There are other factors, underlying health conditions, diabetes, hypertension, and all these, underlying diseases. They are more common also among people, in ethnic minorities than you would find, with their white counterpart. So in a nutshell, if you are from an ethnic minority, you have about 2 times more chance to die for, catch COVID than your white counterpart. And all of this is mainly socioeconomic, but also, inequality in healthcare delivery. That can also, that can also decide on the fate or outcome of your, of your disease. If you catch COVID, how well you're treated in hospital compared to your white counterpart and all that stuff. So it's a lot more complicated than just genetic. So far, there is no scientific evidence to confirm that genetically, if you have a certain genetic type, you are better off also. So that's not the case.
Yeah, great answers.
Yeah, and I would just also say that we should also think of all of the numbers as sort of like the tip of the iceberg, right? Because where you test more, you'll see a better picture. So in places that may have limited resources and weren't testing as much, we may have an underreporting of the actual number of cases and the actual number of deaths. So as much as I think we sort of look at this tracker and think that like these numbers are set in stone, I would just say that everyone should sort of take them with a grain of salt, right? Because we're not catching every case. And in places that have to decide about whether or not they want to put funds into taking care of people who are already sick or funds in tracking cases and diagnosing, we may not get a really full picture of really what the impact is there. So, I would also say that, potentially the numbers that are coming off of the African continent may be underrepresentations of the actual real cost of the virus there. I would also say that we're still really learning a lot about this virus. I think we all kind of know that this ACE2 receptor is very important for entry into the cell, but I think there may be other avenues in which the virus can enter in the cell and other avenues in which, so while we think that like whatever cell types have ACE are the cells that it infects, I don't think that that's fully explored yet. So we really need to know a bit more about how this virus actually really works. I think we have an idea of a piece of it, but we don't have the full picture of really what the virus is doing when it infects us.
Yeah. I wanted to say something very quickly about age, because it's very clear that young people, 0 to 18, you only have 391 of those people that have died in the US of 660,000. You see what I'm saying? So it's very clear that age is a clear difference in terms of susceptibility that leads to hospitalizations and mortality. It turns out very young children, it's believed that when they become infected with COVID, they become infected with COVID and it doesn't go farther than the neck, is the way they put it. Suggesting that children have a more quiescent immune system, meaning that it's not overactivated. Children are infected with things all the time. What it means is that their immune system is constantly being activated. And it's believed because children's immune systems are constantly activated, when they even come in contact with a virus like COVID, their immune systems come into play very quickly. Another thing is that children do not usually have any significant underlying comorbidities that you see in older people. And one of the other things is that children have the capacity to regenerate pulmonary epithelium much better than older folks do. And so when you put all those factors together, and again, for those people that go through the more difficult parts of COVID, is when the lower airway becomes infected and basically the lungs become compromised and they develop acute respiratory distress. And those are people that are in for a more difficult time with COVID. But in children, unless that child usually has an underlying condition of some sort, usually it's an asymptomatic infection. And you see that by the 391 deaths in children in the US compared to 660,000 deaths.
Yeah, it's clearly impacting different groups very differently across the world, frankly.
Yes.
And just to, so I know we're kind of running out of time now, so I just want to ask one final question from the audience. And I'm just going to direct this question to you, Dr. Robinson, because I know that you have worked a bit around global health. And one question was basically asking, you know, with this idea that, or Dr. Alcendor, that you mentioned some concerns that Black populations wouldn't get as effective vaccines as their white counterparts. And so one person is asking that the fact that, you know, communities in the global south are receiving vaccines at a much kind of lower rate, is there any possibility that they would receive vaccines that are, for example, close to expiration, and then that could impact kind of efficacy that way? Like, is that a concern for people in those communities?
Well, I would say that no. So any vaccines that are sort of expired would not be given. I mean, I think we've talked a lot. I mean, unfortunately, many vaccines have actually been wasted, right? Because they expired and there weren't enough people to take them. Of course, all of these vaccines, I know there's an issue sort of with the cold storage, right? So they have to be kept at very cold temperatures in order for them to maintain their efficacy. But I think we've seen sort of throughout this pandemic that people have been pretty rigid with this issue. There's been, you know, if people have taken out some number of vaccines and they haven't been able to be given it, they just have to be destroyed. I think that I can understand that fear. I think that having a system and a workflow where they're kind of coming into these communities and talking to them in a space where they can understand and they're not talking down to them, and we're explaining why we're doing it. I think we're getting to the point where we do have to have that individual connection where it's your doctor who's telling you should do this, or this is a friend of yours who got it already and said that they did okay, and that's why you go in to do it. So I would really assuage that fear. That's not what anyone's trying to do here. The whole goal is really to get as many people vaccinated who are at risk as possible. I would also say, I know there have been a lot of fears around side effects of the vaccine. We didn't talk a lot about that. I do think that we should just all remember that the risks of infection, the risks of blood clot with infection, the risk of heart inflammation with infection are much higher than those with vaccination. And so as we're moving to sort of expand the number of people who can get vaccinated into, you know, pediatric populations, I just want us to keep that in mind, that we are looking at a risk benefit, and the risk of those side effects with infection is actually also higher than with vaccination.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you very much. So I wanted
to say something about the logistics of vaccines. Yesterday, I had to go into the house of an elderly person who was not ambulatory and required me to go in her kitchen to help deliver a vaccine to her. What I mean by that is that vaccines are not the kind of thing that you can bring in the hot sun and not have proper infrastructure to keep it cold. You see what I'm saying? The cold chain with vaccines are very important. And when the cold chain breaks down, that's problematic. And so when we look at global inequities for vaccines, again, this may be an issue we don't know anything about. meaning that the majority of these vaccines at least need some level of cold storage. We talk to our colleagues in Brazil every Friday, and they tell us Brazil has a very difficult time with COVID-19 right now. And he told us, and this is a researcher, that they simply do not have the cold infrastructure in place in Brazil to store a lot of vaccines. They just don't have it. And so what I'm saying is that when it comes to global equity with vaccines, you need to have the infrastructure to support the storage and keep these cold chains established for you to get vaccines. And of course, it's going to take money to do both of those things, vaccines and cold storage. And remember, you have to have qualified professionals delivering that vaccine to people.
Martina, before you move on, can I just say something really important about
yeah, absolutely.
vaccination? I just want people to know that vaccines are the only public health intervention that brings equality in society. So this idea that one vaccine used in one part of the world is superior to another vaccine used in another part of the world really doesn't exist. If you look around in the West, for example, where we have the opportunity for vaccination, for example, in the UK or anywhere in the US, everybody is given the free choice to come out and take a vaccine. I mean, vaccination is the only thing that can bring that equity in terms of medical access to a medical intervention. No other medication can you walk into a healthcare and then get for free, or maybe just go in and decide which one to get, or is offered to the general population at the same time. But with the vaccination program, we've seen vaccination being offered to every community, every single community at the same time to prevent them from catching COVID, but also to protect them from the detrimental effect of COVID. So this is one of the advantages of having vaccination, or encouraging vaccination, or having a vaccination program. It brings equity in society. You don't have to wait, for people to fall in sick to go to hospital, because we know what can happen there. There could be some inequality in terms of the quality of treatment they get. But with vaccination, having vaccines accessible by everybody in society just brings equality, because if you get the Pfizer vaccine, whether you are rich or poor, if you walk into any vaccination center, you will get the vaccine that is available there. That is a luxury we haven't seen before, in the history of, I wouldn't say in the history of mankind, but, in many, many, many years when it comes to accessing vaccines. So the other thing about the vaccines that can be available to other people in the global South, this has to be dependent on the infrastructure that exists in those places. For example, the Pfizer-Moderna vaccine, they require storage at very, very low temperatures. In most poorer part of the world, access to electricity is difficult, and access, having that infrastructure in place, can be expensive. So in terms of the vaccines that can be accessible to them, we have to make sure the vaccines that gets to them are practically possible for them to keep and to use. So the AstraZeneca vaccine, Oxford AstraZeneca, seems to be a very good vaccine when it comes to its practical usage in low and middle income countries, because it leverages on the existing infrastructures there. It doesn't require ultra chain storage, which requires a lot of infrastructure that doesn't exist in those places. So the vaccines that people are getting in certain part of the world has to do with the practicality of the people in those part of the world to be able to store and use those vaccines. But all the vaccines, irrespective of where they are produced or which company produces them, serve the same purpose when it comes to protecting people against infection, severe disease, and death. And the reason why also a lot of people have been having messages, people telling me, oh, why are we getting vaccines in Africa coming from India? Or why are we getting vaccines coming from other part of the world instead of, in the UK or, in the US and stuff like that? The question is simple. Even in the UK, most of the vaccines we are receiving, comes from India. India is the leading producer of vaccine in the world. Most of the vaccines, that are available in the world, or across the world are produced in India. So it's the largest manufacturer of vaccine across the world. So they have been producing most of the vaccines, specifically the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. They've been one of the leading producers of that vaccine. And they also have the capacity to produce vaccine at a much higher dose, but also at a much cheaper cost. So in terms of affordability also, the vaccine they produce of the highest quality, but they also produce vaccines that can be affordable to people across the world. And that's important as well. So in a nutshell, the vaccines are bringing in equality rather than disparity.
That's amazing. I think that's a brilliant point to end on. And I think we've seen the impact of vaccines when you look at, previous diseases. The only diseases that have been eradicated is through vaccination. So yeah, obviously there's still an inequality, but if we can make sure people are getting access, are being informed and making informed decisions, then hopefully we're kind of adding to that fight against healthcare inequality. Absolutely.
I have one minor point to make at the end here. One minor point, and that is, I go and I talk to parents who have school children, and I ask them, your children have been getting vaccines since they were 6 months old, pretty much, even younger, some of them. And I ask them, to go to public school, you have to have vaccinations, which are mandatory in the United States. And I ask them, during the course of, say, 18 months to 18 years old, how many vaccines do you think your children will get in the United States? And when I tell them 74, they can't believe it. And the reason being is that vaccines have been effective and safe for decades. Vaccines has allowed us to live 30 years longer than we did 100 years ago. Vaccines are one of the most scrutinized public health interventions that we know, going through everything from the antigen discovery to manufacturing and delivery of that vaccine. It goes through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, a data safety monitoring board, the FDA advisory board that I had the privilege to sit on, and the FDA committee itself, and subsequently the CDC. And subsequently to that, phase 4, which is pharmacovigilance, that allows you to follow a vaccine in people years and years after they get it. So vaccines have done us a favor. We are going from the efforts of variolation back in 13 BC to the coronavirus mRNA vaccines that we have today. We have come a long way with vaccines. We expect to go longer with good and effective vaccines.
That is a great conclusion. Thank you very much, Dr. Alcendor, for that very powerful point. And I could speak to you all three so much longer, but unfortunately we've run out of time. So I just want to thank you again for attending, for sharing your very valuable insights, and also for the work that you have all done on this pandemic and on improving healthcare and science for what I'm sure will be many years to come. So hopefully to our audience, we've addressed some of your questions. This recording of this panel has been recorded, so feel free to send it to people who haven't been able to watch. It will be on our YouTube channel. And also we should have a feedback form linked in the YouTube on the YouTube page. So we'd love to hear from you so we can continue to improve our events and provide you with events that you're actually interested in. And as a final point, Black and Immunos continue to do lots of this work to highlight the science and to continue these kind of conversations. And we are planning our Black and Immuno Week, which will happen on the 14th to the 20th of November this year. So please do look out for more information on that, where we'll have many other speakers and activities that you can get involved with. And that's it from me. Thank you again to our panelists, and I hope everyone has a good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.